The envelope arrived on a Tuesday. No return address, no signature. Just a number written in pencil, like whoever wrote it wasn't sure it was real yet. February 1935. The cold comes off the Hudson like it has somewhere to be. It moves through Harlem the same way it always does down Lenox Avenue, up 7th, cutting through the gaps between buildings that were never designed to keep anything warm. People here have learned to dress for it, not just the weather, everything. You have to understand what Harlem was in 1935 before you can understand anything else. Not the Harlem of postcards, not the Renaissance version that white journalists came uptown to romanticize in their Sunday columns and then drove back downtown to forget. The real Harlem, the one where a woman named Mrs. Clara Watkins woke at 4:47 every morning to start her day before the city decided what her day was going to be, where she pressed her uniform, packed a lunch she couldn't quite afford, and walked 14 blocks to clean a building she would never be allowed to live in. The one where a man named Roosevelt, not the president, just a man named after hope, stood on the corner of 116th and 8th every morning, waiting for work that showed up 3 days out of 7. If the weather held and the foreman felt generous, the Depression had not arrived in Harlem the way it arrived in the rest of America. In the rest of America, the Depression was a fall. In Harlem, it was a confirmation. The poverty was not new. The hunger was not new. The feeling of being looked past, counted last, paid least, none of that was new. What was new was that now, for the first time in a long time, white America felt some of what black Harlem had been feeling since before anyone alive could remember. There was a kind of quiet, unspoken recognition in that. Not satisfaction. Not cruelty. Just recognition. Now you know, the streets seem to say. Now you have some idea. On 116th Street, the day started before sunrise. The fish man came first. Then the bread cart. Then the women with their aprons already on, moving fast, heads down, carrying the weight of households that would fall apart without them and would never fully credit them for holding. By 7 in the morning, the numbers runners were out. This is the part that requires explanation for anyone who wasn't there. The numbers game called that plainly, without embarrassment, was not simply gambling. Not in Harlem, not in 1935. It was infrastructure. A penny, a nickel, sometimes a dime. You picked 3 numbers. You gave your slip to the runner. The runner brought it to the controller. The controller brought it to the bank. The bank, in this case, was not a building on Wall Street that required 2 forms of identification, a co-signer and the quiet understanding that certain kinds of people were not truly welcome to certain kinds of money. The bank was a man, or a network of men and women who understood that in a neighborhood where the actual banks had already decided you were not worth the paperwork, someone had to hold the money. Someone had to be trustworthy. Someone had to be there when the rent came due on the 1st and the paycheck hadn't arrived yet. The numbers provided that, not cleanly, not legally, but reliably. And in 1935, reliable was the rarest thing in the world. The Italian families controlled large pieces of it. They had moved in from downtown, the way they moved into everything gradually, then all at once, offering partnership that was really ownership dressed in polite language. Some men accepted those terms. Some men had no choice. But on certain blocks on this block, the one that mattered, the one where the real weight was held, the operation ran differently. It ran through people who lived there, through people who knew every name on every door, who knew which family had a sick child and which landlord had raised the rent and which man had just lost his job at the docks and needed 2 more weeks before he could make good. That kind of knowledge is not just information. That kind of knowledge is power shaped into something that looks almost like care. You felt it before you saw it. The way certain conversations paused at certain intersections. The way a runner would make a slight adjustment, not a stop, not a redirect, just a slight, almost imperceptible change in direction when a particular car came around the corner. The way the men who collected debts in other parts of the city collected them differently here, with more patience, with a longer timeline, with an awareness that certain lines, once crossed, could not be uncrossed. Nobody posted signs. Nobody made announcements. You just knew. The way you knew which streets were safe at which hours. The way you knew which landlords would fix the heat and which ones you'd be arguing with until April. The way you knew, without being told, that some things in this neighborhood operated under a different set of rules than the rules printed in the newspapers downtown. It was Mrs. Watkins who noticed it first. She couldn't have told you what, exactly. She would have struggled to put language to it if you'd asked her on that particular February morning as she walked her 14 blocks in the cold. But something was different. The runner on the corner, young man named Darius, 22, wore the same brown coat every day regardless of temperature, was standing slightly differently than usual. Not scared. Not obvious about it. Just still. The way an animal is still when it hears something in the distance that hasn't arrived yet. And then there was the car. Black. No markings. Moved slowly down 116th Street like it was reading addresses. Not stopped. Just slow. The kind of slow that means someone inside is making a list. Mrs. Watkins kept walking. She didn't look at the car directly. You didn't in Harlem. Looking directly at something like that was an invitation to be seen, but she noted it. The way women who have survived by noticing things note everything. She would mention it, later, to her neighbor. Who would mention it to her husband? Who ran numbers on the west side of the block? Who knew exactly who needed to hear it? That was the intelligence network of 116th Street. Not phones, not meetings, not written reports. Women walking to work in the cold, and whatever that car was looking for, whatever that slow, deliberate drive down the block was the beginning of, it had already been seen. It had already been noted. And somewhere, in a room that won't be described yet, a man who had heard about the car, before the car had even turned the corner, set down his coffee, looked out a window at the February sky, and said nothing, just looked. The way a man looks when he already knows what's coming, and has already decided what he's going to do about it. 2 miles south. The same morning, a different kind of meeting was already underway. There is a particular kind of authority that does not announce itself. It doesn't need to. You've seen it, maybe, in a grandfather who never raised his voice at the dinner table, but whose silence, when it came, was louder than anything else in the room. Or in a doctor who walks into a waiting area full of anxious people and somehow, just by being present, makes the anxiety smaller. It has nothing to do with size, nothing to do with volume. It has to do with something that cannot be taught and cannot be faked and cannot be borrowed from someone else. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson had it from the time he was young enough that the people around him didn't quite have words for what they were seeing. They just knew to pay attention when he walked in. He was born in 1,905 inches Spartanburg, South Carolina. Came north the way so many came north on a train, with very little and with the particular determination of someone who has already decided they are not going back. He was not large, 5'9" on a day when he stood straight. Medium build, dark eyes that moved slowly and missed nothing. He dressed carefully. Not expensively, not always, but carefully. There is a difference. Expensive says, look what I have. Careful says, I know exactly who I am. In 1935, at 30 years old, Ellsworth Johnson Bumpy, they called him, for a bump on the back of his skull that was there from birth and never explained was not yet the legend he would become, but he was already something. Already something that people sensed before they could name it. The diner on 116th Street was called Mabel's. Not after a current Mabel. The original Mabel had sold it to a man named Curtis in 1928, who kept the name because the neighborhood knew it, and the neighborhood knowing something was worth more than being technically accurate. Bumpy ate there most mornings. Not always the same time. Not always the same seat. But most mornings, if you knew where to look, you would find him at one of the 4 tables near the back window that looked out onto the alley, and, beyond the alley, the side wall of the building on 117th. He ate, simply, eggs, toast, coffee that Curtis made strong enough to hold a spoon upright. He read when he ate newspapers, sometimes books, whatever was moving through his hands that week. This is the detail that people who didn't know him always got wrong. They expected something else. A performance, a posture, men positioned around him, eyes scanning doorways, hands never far from pockets. That was not how Bumpy moved. He had people, yes, men who knew their positions and held them without being told. But they were not theater. They were not decoration. They were simply there the way certain things are simply there. The way a foundation is there, even when you can't see it and only notice it the moment something tests it. The morning after the black car moved down 116th Street, Bumpy was at Mabel's by 7:15. He had already been briefed, not through any formal channel, not through a phone call or a written note, through the same network that ran everything here, word moving mouth to mouth, the way music moves through a building, through walls you can't see, arriving before you can explain how. He knew about the car. He knew the plates. He knew which direction it had come from and which direction it had gone. He sat with his coffee and his newspaper, and he did not look like a man who had just received information that should have changed the temperature of the morning. He looked like a man eating breakfast. That was the discipline. That was the part that took years to build, and that most men, even men who thought they understood this life, never fully achieved. The ability to receive bad news and let your face remain the same. Not blankness, not performance, just stillness. The kind of stillness that says, I have already thought further ahead than this moment. This moment does not require my panic. My panic would not help it. A young man came in at 7:40. His name was Marcus, 19 years old, fast on his feet, smart enough to be useful, young enough to still be nervous about it. He sat down across from Bumpy without being invited. This was notable. Most people waited. Most people stood at the edge of the table until some signal, a look, a slight movement of the hand told them they could sit. Marcus sat without waiting, which meant the news he carried was news he had decided couldn't wait for protocol. Bumpy looked up from the paper. Not quickly, not startled. Just lifted his eyes the way you lift your eyes when something you've been expecting finally arrives. He waited. Marcus leaned forward, spoke quietly. The details don't matter here, the specific words, the specific intelligence. What matters is what happened when Marcus finished talking. Bumpy looked at him for 3 seconds. Then he went back to the newspaper. Marcus sat there, uncertain whether he'd been dismissed, whether the information had landed, whether something was going to happen now, or whether he was supposed to do something or say something else. Then Bumpy, without looking up, "Get Curtis to bring you some coffee. You look cold." That was all. Marcus would talk about that moment for the rest of his life. Not because of what was said, because of what wasn't said, because of the absolute, unshakable certainty that radiated from a man reading a newspaper who had just been told that someone, somewhere, had decided he was a problem to be solved and had responded by ordering coffee. This is how Harlem knew him. Not through speeches, not through public displays, through moments exactly like that one small, quiet, easy to miss if you weren't paying attention that accumulated over years into something enormous. The woman who ran numbers on the east side of 8th Avenue, her name was Dolores, and she had been doing it since before Bumpy had any real standing. She described him once to a journalist who came uptown asking questions in the mid-1940s and published none of what she said because none of it fit the story he'd come looking for. She said, "He never took from the neighborhood. That's what you have to understand. Every man who came before him, and plenty who came after, they all thought the neighborhood was the resource, something to be drawn from. Bumpy thought the neighborhood was the thing to be protected. There's a difference. You can feel that difference. People feel it, even when they can't name it." The children knew his name, not because their parents told them to fear it, because their parents, in moments when they thought the children weren't listening, said it with a specific kind of weight, a weight that is different from fear, different from admiration, something in between that doesn't have a clean word in English. The closest is relief. The way you feel relief when someone capable is standing between you and something dangerous. Even if you don't fully understand the danger, even if you never ask about it, you feel the relief of that presence the way you feel the warmth of a building you're standing next to out of the wind. But here is the other thing, the thing that enemies consistently failed to account for. Bumpy Johnson was not soft. The restraint was not weakness dressed in better clothes. The calm was not the calm of a man who had nothing inside it. There were men in Harlem, men who had crossed certain lines, who had moved against the people he protected, who had mistaken patience for permission, who understood this distinction with a clarity that came too late to be useful to them. The restraint was real. The principle behind it was real, but so was the other thing. The thing that lived underneath the stillness, like current, lives underneath still water. You couldn't see it. You couldn't predict when it would surface. But if you were paying attention, really paying attention, you could feel it. The way you feel weather before the weather arrives. On the morning of February 11th, 1935, Bumpy finished his coffee, folded his newspaper in half, and left a 50-cent tip for Curtis, even though the coffee and eggs had cost 30 cents. He stood, buttoned his coat, looked once at the window, at the alley, at the wall beyond it, at the gray February sky above the rooftops. Then he walked out. The door closed behind him. The three men who had been sitting at three separate tables, in three separate corners of Mabel's men who had come in at different times, ordered different things, appeared entirely unconnected, stood up within 30 seconds of each other, and followed. Curtis watched them go. Then he picked up the 50 cents, held it for a moment, and put it in his pocket. He didn't know exactly what was coming, but he knew something was coming. And he knew, the way everyone on that block knew, that whatever it was already being handled. 2 miles south, the same morning, a man named Arthur Flegenheimer was finishing a different kind of breakfast in a different kind of room. He had not yet made his mistake, but he was about to start moving toward it. His real name was Arthur Flegenheimer. He changed it because Arthur Flegenheimer didn't fit on the side of a newspaper the way Dutch Schultz did. That detail matters more than it seems. A man who understands branding, who understands that the name people say shapes the fear they feel, is not a simple man. Arthur Flegenheimer knew exactly what he was building and exactly how he wanted it to be seen. That kind of intelligence is real. It deserves acknowledgement, because the easiest thing in the world is to look back at a man who lost and call him a fool from the beginning. Dutch Schultz was not a fool. That was part of the problem. He was born in the Bronx in 1902, 3 years younger than Bumpy Johnson, grew up in a neighborhood that taught the same lessons every neighborhood, like it taught that the official routes to anything were not designed with you in mind, that the men who ate well were the men who made their own rules, and that hesitation was the most expensive habit a young man could develop. He learned those lessons faster than most. By his mid-20s, he had built a bootlegging operation that ran through the Bronx with a precision that actual businesses, legitimate ones, would have struggled to match. He understood logistics. He understood loyalty, how to buy it, how to enforce it, how to know the difference between a man who would hold and a man who would fold the moment the pressure changed. He understood violence the way a surgeon understands a scalpel, not something to be used constantly. Something to be used correctly. Once, if possible, decisively, always. The body count behind Dutch Schultz's rise is not disputed. What is sometimes missed is the selectivity of it. He didn't kill carelessly. He killed strategically. And for years, for most of his career, that strategy worked. By 1935, Dutch Schultz controlled the Bronx beer trade, the policy rackets in several Manhattan territories, and was in the process of what he considered a natural expansion into Harlem. Natural is the word he would have used. Not invasion, not takeover, expansion. The distinction was important to him. Invasion implies resistance. Expansion implies inevitability. And Dutch Schultz, by 1935, had become a man who believed that his movement was inevitable. This is what success does to a certain kind of mind. It doesn't corrupt it immediately. It doesn't turn intelligence into stupidity overnight. It does something more subtle. It begins to filter information. Every time Schultz had pushed, the resistance had eventually bent. Every man who had told him no had eventually told him yes, or had been removed from the conversation entirely. His brain had been trained by years of evidence to interpret resistance as temporary, as a negotiating position, as theater, as something that would resolve itself in his favor if he applied enough patience or enough pressure or the correct combination of both. He had never encountered resistance that was neither negotiating nor afraid. He didn't know that category existed. The morning of February 11th, 1935, Dutch Schultz was in a restaurant on the lower end of Manhattan that he used for meetings that he didn't want recorded in any location that could be subpoenaed. The restaurant was called Carmine's. It had red tablecloths and photographs on the walls of Italian landscapes that no one in the restaurant had ever visited. He was eating alone, which was unusual. The men who worked for him, and there were always men nearby, were positioned at the bar, at the door, at a table by the window. But Schultz ate alone. He preferred it. Eating was the one time in his day when he allowed himself to think without performing thinking for someone else's benefit. He had ordered eggs. He had ordered coffee. He was reading a file that one of his men had assembled over the previous 3 weeks on the structure of Harlem's numbers operation. The file was thorough. It listed controllers, runners, territories. It listed approximate weekly revenue. It listed names. Bumpy Johnson's name appeared on the 3rd page, not at the top, not flagged in any special way. Just a name among other names, a position in a structure that Schultz was preparing to reorganize. He read it, turned the page. This was his first mistake, not the plan itself. The turning of the page, the fact that the name landed without weight, without the pause that name should have created in the mind of a man who prided himself on reading rooms and reading people. He turned the page. And in doing so, he told himself something that wasn't true, that this was a name like other names, a position like other positions, a problem like other problems. His lieutenant's name was Lulu Rosencrantz, a man built like a question mark tall, slightly stooped, with eyes that were always calculating something you couldn't see. Rosencrantz had been with Schultz for years, long enough to know when to speak and when to stay quiet. He sat down across from Schultz at 9:15 that morning and waited for the eggs to be finished. Then he said, "The Harlem thing. I want to talk about the approach." Schultz didn't look up immediately. He was finishing something in the file. Then he closed it, set it to the side, and looked at Rosencrantz with the particular attention he gave to people he trusted to waste as little of his time as possible. "Talk," he said. Rosencrantz chose his words with the care of a man who had learned, the hard way, that imprecision was expensive in rooms like this one. "The Johnson situation," he said. "He's not the same as the others." Schultz picked up his coffee. "Meaning what?" "Meaning the neighborhood is with him. Not because they're afraid of him, because everyone says that," Schultz said. "Everyone says their man has the neighborhood. Then we talk to the neighborhood, and the neighborhood is practical." Rosencrantz nodded slowly, the nod of a man who does not fully agree, but has decided this is not the moment to press it further. "We send the first message this week?" he asked. "Send it Tuesday," Schultz said. He picked up the file again. The conversation was over. Rosencrantz stood, straightened his jacket, moved toward the door. He paused once, just briefly, just for a beat at the edge of the room. Something in him wanted to say one more thing. He didn't. He walked out. The door closed. Schultz turned another page. Here is what Dutch Schultz understood better than almost anyone alive in 1935. He understood that power is maintained through consistency, that you cannot make a threat and then fail to enforce it, that the moment you show flexibility in a direction that looks like weakness, every man watching, and there are always men watching, recalibrates his understanding of you. He had built an entire operation on that principle. And that principle was correct. It just didn't apply here. Because what Schultz had never encountered, what his entire career had never required him to account for, was a man on the other side who operated from the same principle. A man who also understood that you cannot show flexibility in a direction that looks like weakness. A man who also had people watching. A man for whom the stakes were not about territory or revenue or the organizational chart of a criminal enterprise. A man for whom the stakes were the neighborhood itself. The people in it. The fragile, hard-won dignity of a community that had survived everything this city had thrown at it and was not going to be absorbed by a man from the Bronx who thought Harlem was an asset on a balance sheet. Dutch Schultz had fought men who wanted more than he had. He had never fought a man who was protecting something he considered more important than what he stood to gain. He didn't know how to read that. He didn't have a file for it. Tuesday came. The message was sent. It arrived on 116th Street in the form of two men in good coats who spoke politely and smiled the way people smile when the smile is the most threatening part of the conversation. They went to the right address. They asked for the right person. They delivered the message clearly and without unnecessary drama. The message was simple. Mr. Schultz was prepared to be generous. Mr. Schultz was prepared to offer terms that any reasonable man would find more than acceptable. Mr. Schultz was prepared to make this easy, the implication unspoken, but present in the room, the way smoke is present in a room before you see the fire was that easy, was the preferred option, that the other options existed, and that Mr. Schultz had used them before. The two men waited. The answer they received was not the answer they brought back to Schultz. What they brought back was, "He'll think about it." What was actually said in the room, in the moment, before they left, was nothing. Not a refusal, not a counteroffer, not a threat. Nothing. A stillness so complete that the two men, walking back to the car they'd come in, found themselves talking faster than usual, filling the silence they'd brought with them from that room. They didn't report that part to Schultz. Men like them rarely reported the things they couldn't explain. And they could not explain the feeling that had stayed with them from that room, the feeling that they had delivered a message to a man who had already written his response before they arrived. Schultz received their report, nodded. "He'll think about it," he repeated. Then, with the certainty of a man who has never had to revise his understanding of a situation, "They all think about it. Then they come around." He poured more coffee. Outside the window of Carmine's, Manhattan moved the way it always moved, indifferent, loud, continuous. Schultz watched it for a moment. Then he looked back at the file. He had other problems that morning, other territories, other negotiations, other men who needed managing. Harlem was on the list. It was not at the top. That was his second mistake. And unlike the first that turned page, the name that didn't land this one would cost him in ways that couldn't be undone. On 116th Street, the two men in good coats had already been described to three separate people before their car reached the end of the block. By nightfall, Bumpy Johnson knew everything about them except their mothers' names. He filed it away, said nothing, waited. Before you can understand the fight, you have to understand what was being fought over. Not money. Money was the surface. Money was the thing that men like Schultz could see and measure and put in a file with approximate weekly figures and projected annual returns. Money was legible to him. What was underneath the money was not. December 1934. 2 months before the black car moved slowly down 116th Street. A woman named Estelle Bowman sat across a kitchen table from her sister, Patricia, in a third-floor apartment on 118th Street that cost $11 a month and was worth about $6 if the landlord had been honest about the radiator and the gap under the front door that let the winter in like it had a key. Estelle was 34 years old. She worked days at a laundry on 125th and took in sewing at night after her 2 children were asleep. Her husband, James, had been out of steady work since the spring of 1933, not for lack of trying, for lack of the specific kind of trying that the city rewarded. He applied for work the way men in Harlem applied for work, showing up early, dressed carefully, with references and competence, and the particular brand of patience required of a man who knows that his qualifications are being read through a filter he didn't design and cannot appeal. He was not bitter about it. He was tired. There is a difference. Estelle had been playing the numbers since 1931, a nickel a day, sometimes a dime when the week had been good. She had a system, not superstition exactly, but a particular way of reading the small events of her daily life for numerical meaning. The number of steps it took to walk from her door to the corner, the time she woke up before the alarm, the address of the building she passed on her way to the laundry that always had its lights on before sunrise. She won twice in 3 years. Not large amounts, but enough, both times, to matter in the specific way that only people who have lived very close to the edge understand mattering. The first time, $4.60. She bought her son a pair of shoes. Real ones, from a store, not the second-hand pair, 2 sizes too large that he had been wearing since September. The second time, $11.30. She paid the rent, all of it, on time, without borrowing, without negotiating, without the specific shame of standing in front of a landlord explaining yourself. She paid it and walked away and felt, for one afternoon, something that is very hard to name, a kind of dignity that the legitimate economy had been systematically withholding from her for 4 years. This is what the numbers racket was in Harlem in 1935. Not what it looked like from downtown. Not what it looked like in the files that the district attorney's office kept on organized crime in Upper Manhattan. Not a vice. Not a predatory system bleeding a vulnerable community dry. Something more complicated than that. Something that the people who ran the investigations were structurally unable to see because they were not looking for complexity, they were looking for criminality, and complexity doesn't fit neatly into an indictment. The numbers moved approximately $5 million a week through Harlem in 1935. $5 million. In a neighborhood where the average family earned less than $1,000 a year. That number is not evidence of exploitation. It is evidence of scale, of how many people were participating, of how deeply woven into the fabric of daily economic life this system had become. And unlike the money that left Harlem through rent paid to landlords who lived elsewhere and spent elsewhere, unlike the money that left through utilities, through the stores, on 125th Street, owned by men who drove back downtown at night. The numbers money circulated. The runners lived in the neighborhood. The controllers lived in the neighborhood. The bankers, the men and women at the top of the operation, they lived in the neighborhood. They ate at Mabel's. They bought from the fishman. They paid their children's school fees at the same schools where everyone else's children were trying to learn in overcrowded classrooms with not enough books. When Estelle Bowman won $4.60, that money came from a system managed by people who knew her name. When she paid the rent with $11, the man who paid her had grown up 6 blocks from where she sat. That is not nothing. In 1935, in Harlem, that is almost everything. Dutch Schultz's file had the $5 million figure. It had the territorial breakdown. It had the organizational chart approximate, assembled from informants and surveillance and educated guesses of who controlled what and where the money flowed. What the file did not have, what no file assembled by men from outside this neighborhood could ever fully contain, was Estelle Bowman's kitchen table, her son's shoes. The month she paid the rent on time and walked away feeling like herself. The file did not have the 40-year-old man on the corner of 116th and Lenox, who used his controller's income to send his daughter to college in 1933, the first person in 4 generations of his family to go and who stood a little differently because of it. Walked a little differently. The file did not have the network of informal loans not written down, not collateralized, not reported to anyone that moved through the numbers operation the way blood moves through a body. Man loses his job in October. His runner knows. His controller knows. Money appears not charity, not a transaction, just money, because the neighborhood takes care of its own when it can. Paid back when possible. Not always. The ledger for that was never written down. It was kept in memory, in obligation, in the understanding that you were part of something larger than your individual account. Bumpy Johnson understood all of this, not because he had studied it, or been briefed on it, or read it in a file. He understood it because he lived in it, because when he walked down 116th Street and a woman nodded at him from a second-floor window, he knew her name. He knew her husband's name. He knew which of her children had been sick in November, and whether they'd recovered. He knew what she needed and what she could bear, and where the line was between a neighborhood that functioned and a neighborhood that broke. This was not sentiment. This was intelligence of a kind that cannot be extracted from surveillance reports. It was also the source of his authority, the real source, the one that Schultz could not find in any file because it wasn't a thing that could be taken, absorbed, reorganized, or managed from downtown. It was relational. It was earned over years. It was renewed daily through presence and memory and the thousand small acts of someone who understood that leadership in a place like this was not a position. It was a practice. There was a moment late autumn, 1934, 3 months before Schultz's men came up 116th Street, that nobody outside the neighborhood ever reported. A landlord named Greenberg had decided, in the way that landlords in certain moods decide things, that he was going to raise the rent on 14 apartments on 117th Street by 30%, effective the 1st of November. He sent the notices on a Wednesday. By Thursday afternoon, Bumpy Johnson had been told he did not call a meeting. He did not make a speech. He walked to Greenberg's office, a small room above a hardware store on 116th, and he sat across from the man, and he spoke quietly for approximately 8 minutes. What was said in those 8 minutes was never repeated publicly by either man. What is known is that the rent notices were revised by Friday morning. No increase. An apology, even a letter slipped under 14 doors, citing a clerical error. 14 families woke up Saturday morning with the same rent they'd always had. None of them knew how that happened. Some of them suspected. None of them asked. You didn't ask in Harlem when something good happened quietly. You accepted it, the way you accepted good weather, with gratitude and without demanding an explanation of the mechanism. This is what Dutch Schultz was preparing to absorb, not a revenue stream, a system of human relationships so dense and so specific that it functioned like connective tissue holding things together that would have fallen apart without it. A man at the center of that system who was not interchangeable, who could not be bought because what he had was not for sale, who could not be frightened because what he was protecting mattered more to him than what he stood to lose. Schultz looked at the file and saw $5 million a week. What was actually there was 14 families who didn't have to move in November. A daughter in college for the first time in 4 generations. A woman walking away from a rent payment feeling like herself. The numbers told part of the story. The part that mattered didn't have numbers. And this is why, when the men in good coats came up to 116th Street with their polite smiles and their talk of generous terms and easy options, the silence they received was not hesitation. It was not fear dressed as calm. It was not a man weighing his options. It was a man who had already weighed everything worth weighing long before they arrived. A man who knew exactly what he was holding and had already decided he was not letting go of it. The first of the month came. 14 families paid their rent. The same rent as always. None of them knew. Bumpy Johnson was at Mabel's by 7:15. He ordered eggs. He read the paper. He waited. March 4th, 1935. The temperature had risen slightly from February's worst. Not warm, not even close, but the particular kind of cold that feels like a negotiation rather than a punishment. Like Winter was considering its options. 116th Street had its rhythm back. The fish man, the bread cart, the women moving fast, heads down, carrying everything. From the outside, nothing had changed. From the inside, everyone was waiting. The first meeting happened at noon. Not on the street, in the back room of a barber shop on 115th called Eddie's, named after an Eddie who had not been Eddie in the chair for 11 years, but whose name stayed on the window because the neighborhood remembered things longer than most people expected. The room behind the barber shop was small. 4 chairs, a table, a single bulb on a cord that swayed slightly. When the door opened and created shadows that moved like weather, Bumpy arrived at 11:58. He was the last one in, not late, precisely on time. The distinction mattered. The last man through the door in a room like that sets the temperature for everything that followed. He sat, looked at the 3 men already seated, waited. The man who spoke first was not one of Schultz's people. He was an intermediary. A lawyer, technically, though the legal work he did existed primarily as infrastructure for work that was not legal. His name was Harlem. He wore a good suit and spoke with the practiced warmth of someone who had learned that warmth, deployed correctly, could substitute for honesty in most business conversations. He placed a single sheet of paper on the table. He did not slide it toward Bumpy. He placed it in the center, equidistant, like an offering rather than a demand. He said, "Mr. Schultz wants you to know he considers this a partnership, not an acquisition. Equal terms. Shared interest. He's prepared to be very generous with the transition period." Bumpy looked at the paper, did not touch it. The room waited. Harlan continued because silence made him uncomfortable in ways he had never fully resolved. "The numbers on that sheet are real numbers, not an opening position. What's written there is what Mr. Schultz is prepared to honor." Bumpy looked up from the paper, not at Harlan, at the wall behind Harlan, for 4 seconds, then back at the paper, then at Harlan. He said, "Tell Mr. Schultz I'll need some time to consider the terms." Harlan smiled, the smile of a man who had heard that sentence before and knew what it meant, what it always meant in negotiations like this. "He'll come around." He picked up the paper, stood, adjusted his jacket. "Of course," he said, "take the time you need. Mr. Schultz is a patient man." He left. The door swung shut. The bulb swayed once. The 3 men left in the room looked at Bumpy. He was looking at the table, at the spot where the paper had been. Then he looked up. "Nobody touch anything on the east side of 8th until I say so." That was all. They nodded. They left. Bumpy stayed in the room alone for 7 minutes. Nobody who worked for him ever asked what he did in those 7 minutes. They just knew that when he came out, the decision had been made. The patience lasted 11 days. Then Schultz stopped being patient. March 15th, 1935. A runner named Calvin, 20 years old, worked the blocks between 116th and 118th, knew every door, every name, moved through the neighborhood like he'd been born into the rhythm of it. Calvin was picked up at the corner of 117th and 8th at approximately 7:40 in the evening, not by police, by 2 men who came out of a car that had been parked there for 40 minutes. They took him around the corner. They explained, briefly and physically, that the operation he worked for was under new management, that his controller would be receiving new instructions, that this was not a conversation he needed to repeat to anyone in particular. They left him on the pavement. He was not badly hurt. That was deliberate. Bad enough to be a message. Not so bad as to be a declaration. Schultz was still, in his mind, in the negotiation phase. This was a punctuation mark, not a sentence. He expected it to be read as emphasis. Calvin walked himself to a building on 117th, knocked on a second-floor door, and said 7 words to the woman who answered. Those 7 words moved the way everything moved in this neighborhood, mouth to mouth, fast and accurate, through a network that had been built over years for exactly this kind of moment. Bumpy was told within 22 minutes. He was at Mabel's. Curtis was closing up. The last of the coffee had been sitting on the burner long enough to turn from coffee into something else. Bumpy listened. He asked 2 questions. Specific ones, about the car, about the direction it had come from after. He received 2 answers. He nodded once. Then he said to the man who had delivered the message, "Make sure Calvin's taken care of, whatever he needs tonight." The man nodded. "Started to leave," Bumpy said, without looking up, "and tell him he did right. Coming to us first." The men in Bumpy's circle, the ones who had been with him long enough to know the difference between his moods, they felt the shift. Not in anything, he said, not in any visible change of expression or posture. In the quality of the stillness. There is a stillness that means a man is at rest, and there is a stillness that means a man is deciding. Those 2 things look the same from the outside. From the inside, if you know the man, if you have spent enough time in enough rooms with him to read the temperature of his silence, they are entirely different. A man named Robert, who had been with Bumpy since 1931 and would be with him until the end. Robert felt it. He came to Bumpy the following morning, sat down, didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "We're just going to let this sit?" Bumpy poured coffee. "We're going to let it land where it lands," he said. "Then we'll see what it is." Robert looked at him. "I know what it is." "You know what it looks like," Bumpy said. "That's not the same thing." He slid the second cup across the table. "Drink your coffee," he said. "We've got time." Robert drank his coffee. He did not feel like they had time. He kept that to himself. What Bumpy was doing in those days, the days between Calvin and what came next, was not patience for its own sake. It was reading. He was reading Schultz, the way you read weather, not reacting to what was happening right now, but watching the pattern, the pressure systems, the direction of movement. Every action Schultz took told him something. The first meeting the lawyer, the paper in the center of the table, told him Schultz still believed this was a business negotiation. Calvin, the 740 pickup, the deliberate restraint of the violence told him Schultz was escalating, but measuring the escalation. Still believed in the architecture of pressure and response. Still believed that if he applied the right amount of the right kind of discomfort, the resistance would become acceptance. This told Bumpy something important. It told him that Schultz had not yet understood what he was dealing with, which meant there was still time. Not much, but some. He used it to do 2 things. The first, he made certain that every person in his operation understood what was happening and understood their position. Not through a meeting, not through announcements, through individual conversations, specific, personal, tailored to each person's particular fear and particular strength. The woman who ran the East Side numbers, Dolores, he told her what she needed to hear, that her operation was solid, that she was protected, that nothing was changing on her blocks, regardless of what she might hear from men she didn't recognize. She asked him once, directly, looking at him across her kitchen table with the eyes of a woman who had survived too much to accept comfortable lies, "Are you sure about that?" He looked back at her. The same way. "I'm sure," he said. She nodded. She believed him, not because she was naive, because she had been watching him long enough to know the difference between a man who was sure and a man who was performing certainty. The second thing he did was quieter. He made contact, not direct contact, nothing that could be traced or reported or subpoenaed, with certain men in certain positions who were not part of his operation, but who had their own reasons for preferring that Schultz's reach did not extend further than it already had. These were not alliances, not agreements, not anything with terms or conditions or paperwork, just an understanding. The kind of understanding that exists between men who read the same situation from different angles and arrive at the same conclusion about where their interests align. It was quiet work. It left no record, which was exactly the point. March 22nd, 1935. Schultz received a report from Harlem. The report said, essentially, that Bumpy Johnson had still not moved, had not accepted the terms, had not rejected them publicly, had not, as far as anyone could tell, done anything at all. Schultz read the report. Set it down. He's stalling, he said. Harlan, who was not certain that was the right reading, but was not certain enough of his own alternative to offer it, said nothing. Schultz stood, moved to the window, looked at the street below downtown Manhattan, its ordinary Tuesday rhythm, its taxis and foot traffic, and the particular indifference of a city that is always moving towards something else. Give him 1 more week, Schultz said. And if he still hasn't moved? Schultz didn't answer immediately. Then we stop asking. Harlan wrote that down. He did not write down what he felt when Schultz said it. The small, cold thing that moved through him in that moment, the sense, brief and irrational and entirely unverifiable, that something in this situation had already been decided by someone other than Arthur Flegenheimer. He didn't write that down. He capped his pen, straightened his papers, left the room. On 116th Street, a week felt like weather. It was coming regardless. The only question was whether you were going to be standing in the right place when it arrived. Bumpy Johnson was already in position. 1 week later, Schultz stopped asking. That was when the real conversation began. March 29th, 1935. The week ended the way Schultz said it would. Not with a meeting, not with a phone call, not with another lawyer and another piece of paper placed in the center of a table. With a number. The number moved through Harlem the way bad news always moves, faster than anyone wanted it to, slower than it felt. By noon on the 29th, it had reached the barber shop on 115th. By 2 in the afternoon, it had reached Dolores on the east side of 8th. By 4, it had reached Curtis at Mabel's, who heard it from a man who had heard it from a woman who had heard it from someone who claimed to have seen the actual figure written down. The number was a price, Bumpy Johnson's price, not a negotiating figure, not an offer, a bounty. What Dutch Schultz was prepared to pay to any man inside Harlem or out who resolved the Bumpy Johnson problem permanently. This was the line, not the meeting with the lawyer, not Calvin on the pavement on 117th Street. This, because there is a specific quality to a public bounty that is different from every other kind of threat. A private threat says, "We have a disagreement." A public bounty says, "You are already gone. We are simply waiting for the paperwork to clear." It is an act of erasure performed before the fact. It tells the neighborhood, tells everyone watching. Everyone who has been watching that the man at the center of it has already been decided upon, already been judged, already been sentenced. The only thing left is the execution of the sentence. In a neighborhood like Harlem, where dignity was not abstract, where it was a daily practice, a daily insistence against a world that did not automatically grant it, a public bounty was not just a threat to one man. It was a message to everyone who stood near him. This is what happens to men who don't move when we tell them to. This is what happens to the neighborhood that stands behind them. Bumpy was told at 5:15. He was in the back room of a building on 116th, not the barber shop, a different room, one that fewer people knew about, going over something with a man named Thomas who kept the books for a piece of the operation. The man who brought the news was young, nervous in the way of someone carrying something they wish they weren't carrying. He said it plainly, gave the figure, said where it had come from, said what it meant. Bumpy listened. He did not look up from the table while the man was talking. When the man finished, Bumpy said, "Thank you." The man left. Thomas looked at Bumpy. Bumpy looked at the numbers on the table, the same numbers he had been looking at before the interruption. The weekly figures, the controllers, the runners, the 14 blocks that had been running smoothly for years and that he intended to keep running smoothly regardless of what was being said in rooms downtown. He looked at them for another full minute. Then he closed the ledger, looked at Thomas. "Where were we?" he said. Thomas stared at him. "Did you hear what he just—" "I heard him," Bumpy said. "And?" Bumpy leaned back in his chair, looked at the ceiling for a moment, then back at Thomas. "And nothing has changed in the last 4 minutes that wasn't already true this morning." Thomas opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "A price, Bumpy. He put a price. I know what he put. The temperature in the room changed. Not because Bumpy raised his voice. He didn't. Because of the quality of the silence that followed those 4 words. Thomas heard it. Sought back. All right, he said, quietly. All right. But outside that room, in the barber shop, in the diner, on the corners, in the apartments where people spoke in low voices after the children were in bed, it was not all right. The neighborhood had been watching this situation build for weeks. They had watched with the particular combination of trust and anxiety that comes from believing in someone while also understanding that belief is not armor. The runners were nervous. The controllers were nervous. 2 men who had been with Bumpy for years. Men whose loyalty was not in question, men who would not have left under any ordinary pressure, came to Robert separately, on separate days, and said the same thing in different words. This is different now. A price is different. What do we do? Robert brought it to Bumpy. All of it. The names, the words, the specific fear underneath the words. He sat across from Bumpy in the room on 116th and laid it out plainly, the way he always laid things out without editorializing, without softening the edges, because Bumpy had made clear years ago that soft edges were how men made bad decisions. Bumpy listened. Then he said, "Tell them to stay where they are. Do their work. Don't change anything." Robert waited. Then, "That's it? That's it, Bumpy." Robert, 1 word. His name. Said without heat, but said in a way that closed the conversation the way a door closes, not slammed, just shut. Fully, with a finality that made reopening it feel like a violation of something unspoken. Robert nodded. He delivered the message. The 2 men stayed where they were, did their work, didn't change anything. Here is what was happening inside the restraint. What nobody saw, because it wasn't visible, wasn't meant to be visible. Bumpy was moving, not on the street. Not in any way that Schultz's people, who were watching, could track or report or photograph. Through the same network that had always been his real infrastructure. The one that existed not in territories or revenue streams or organizational hierarchies, but in relationships, in debts, in obligations, in the long memory of a neighborhood that kept track of everything. He was calling in things that had been owed for years. Some of them small, a favor here, a name there, a door that needed to be open at a specific time in a specific place. Some of them larger. Old obligations from men who were now in positions of influence, not criminal influence. Some of them men who owed Bumpy Johnson for things that had happened in different years, different circumstances, that had never been spoken about publicly and never would be. He was assembling something, not an army, nothing that dramatic, nothing that loud. A position, the way a chess player assembles a position quietly, over multiple moves, in ways the other player only fully understands when it is too late to respond effectively. Meanwhile, Schultz was reading the silence wrong. This is the thing about silence. It is the most ambiguous language there is. The same silence can mean surrender or preparation, can mean a man has run out of options or a man is conserving them. Schultz read Bumpy's silence as the first kind. His informants, the ones who moved through Harlem reporting back downtown, told him what they could see, which was, nothing had changed. The operation was running. The man was at the diner. No visible response. No visible preparation. Schultz heard this and nodded. "He's frozen," he said. "The price did it. He doesn't know what to do." Nobody in the room disagreed with him. On April 3rd, Schultz made his next move. Not a message this time. Not a lawyer with paper. Action. 2 of Bumpy's controllers, men who ran pieces of the 116th Street operation, were approached directly. Not violently. Not yet. Approached with offers. Specific offers. Good ones. Better money than they were making. A guarantee of protection. A clear message that the transition was happening regardless and that there were 2 ways to be on the right side of it. One of the controllers, a man named Wes, 41 years old, had been in the operation since before Bumpy had his current standing. Wes listened to the offer, asked for 24 hours to think about it. The men who approached him said yes. They thought this was progress. Within those 24 hours, Wes went to Bumpy, told him everything. The exact offer, the exact words, the exact men who had made it. Bumpy listened, said very little. At the end, "You did right." The same 4 words he had said to Calvin. Wes nodded, stood to leave. Bumpy said, "Tell them yes." Wes turned around. Bumpy looked at him, steady, clear. "Tell them you're in. Then come back to me and tell me everything they tell you." Wes understood. He went back. He said yes. And for the next 11 days, everything Schultz told his new asset about the plan for Harlem, the timeline, the specific targets, the names of the men Schultz was relying on inside the neighborhood, came directly to Bumpy Johnson before it went anywhere else. This is the part that Schultz never understood. Not even later. Not even after. He thought he had turned one of Bumpy's men. He had handed Bumpy a window into every room he was planning in. April 12th, 1935. Bumpy sat in the back room on 116th Street. It was late, past 10. The street outside was quieter than the afternoon, but not quiet. Harlem at 10 p.m. was never fully quiet. There was a sound underneath the street sounds. Music from somewhere, a trumpet, faint, doing something slow and deliberate that fit the night better than anything planned could have. Robert was there. Thomas was there. 2 other men whose names don't need recording here. Bumpy had a piece of paper on the table in front of him. Not a ledger this time. A list. Short. 8 items. He went through it, item by item, asked questions, received answers, made 2 small marks. Then he folded the paper, put it in his jacket pocket, looked around the table. He said, "We're done waiting." The room did not erupt. Nobody moved dramatically. Nobody said anything loud or fast or fueled by the release of weeks of held tension. They just looked at him and nodded. The way men nod when something they have known was coming finally arrives. Robert, quietly. "When?" Bumpy looked at the table, at the spot where the paper had been. "Soon," he said. "Then?" "But right." The trumpet outside finished its phrase, held the last note a little longer than seemed necessary, then let it go. Across Harlem, 14 blocks of a numbers operation ran through the night exactly as it always had. Nobody who depended on it knew what was coming. They just felt, in the way that people feel things they cannot name, that something in the air had shifted, like the moment before weather, like the moment before everything becomes clear. April 14th, 1935. Monday. The kind of morning that arrives without announcing itself. No particular weather, no particular sign. Just a Monday in April that looked exactly like the Monday before it and the Monday before that. That was intentional. Bumpy was at Mabel's at 7:15. Eggs, toast, coffee. The newspaper folded to the second page the way he always folded it. Curtis moved behind the counter with the particular efficiency of a man who has learned that mornings run better when nobody asks too many questions. 2 men came in at 7:30, sat at separate tables, ordered separately, appeared entirely unconnected. They were not unconnected. At 7:45, a third man came in, sat at the counter, ordered coffee only. He stayed 4 minutes, left $2 on the counter for a 30-cent coffee. Curtis pocketed the difference without comment. By 8 o'clock, Bumpy had received through the geometry of those arrivals, through what was ordered and what was left and how long each man stayed. Confirmation. Everything was in position. He finished his eggs, read the second page, folded the paper, left a 50-cent tip, walked out. What happened over the next 72 hours was not a battle. That is the first thing to understand. There were no gunfights on 116th Street, no dramatic confrontation in a back room with raised voices and overturned furniture. Nothing that would have given a newspaper photographer anything worth printing. What happened was quieter than that, and permanent in ways that violence rarely is. The first move was information. Everything Wes had delivered 11 days of Schultz's plans, his timeline, his inside contacts, the names of the men he was counting on inside Harlem. Bumpy used it the way a surgeon uses a precise instrument. Not broadly, not loudly. Specifically, the men Schultz was counting on the ones he believed had been turned. The ones he believed were his now found, over the course of 48 hours, that their situations had changed, not through threats, not through violence, through the sudden awareness that everything they had said, everything they had agreed to, everything they had reported downtown, had been heard. Not by Schultz, by Bumpy Johnson. The specific way this was communicated varied by person. Some received a visitor. Some found something waiting for them that made the message impossible to misread. Some simply received a look from a man they recognized. On a corner, they knew a look that said, without words, without theater, without any of the apparatus of threat. We know, all of it. We have known. That was enough. One by one, the contacts Schultz believed he had inside Harlem went quiet, stopped reporting, became unavailable when his people came looking for them. Not dramatically, not loudly. They just became hard to find. The second move was economic. This one took longer to see, but it was the one that mattered most. Schultz's operation required cooperation at the street level, required runners, controllers, collection men who could move through Harlem without friction. Without the neighborhood's tolerance, even passive tolerance, a downtown operation in a place like 116th Street was a man swimming against a current he couldn't see but could never stop feeling. Over the 72 hours following April 14th, that tolerance evaporated. Not through organization, not through meetings or announcements or any coordinated instruction. Through the same mechanism that had always governed how Harlem decided what it accepted and what it didn't. Through the understanding that moved mouth to mouth, door to door, the way everything moved in this neighborhood. Men who worked for Schultz, men who had been moving through these blocks with the casual confidence of people who believed the territory was already theirs, found that doors that had been open were now closed. Found that people who had been cooperative were suddenly not home. Found that the street-level intelligence they had been relying on, the small, daily information that makes an operation run, had dried up overnight, as if the neighborhood itself had simply decided to become unreadable to them, which was exactly what had happened. The third move was the one that reached Dutch Schultz directly. And this is the part where the story becomes a room. April 16th, 1935. A meeting was requested, not by Bumpy, by intermediaries representing interests that Schultz could not ignore, men above his level in the larger architecture of organized crime in New York, men who had their own reasons for preferring stability over Schultz's ongoing attempt to absorb Harlem by force. The meeting was held in a building in Midtown, a room on the 4th floor. No windows that faced the street, a table long enough for 6 men to sit without crowding. Schultz arrived with 2 of his people. Bumpy arrived alone. This detail was noted by every man in the room. Schultz sat across from Bumpy for the first time. He had seen photographs, had received descriptions, had built, over months, an image of the man from second-hand information, the way you build an image of weather from a forecast technically accurate, entirely inadequate for the reality of standing in it. He looked at Bumpy. Bumpy looked back, not with hostility, not with performance, with the same expression he brought to everything: the newspaper at Mabel's, the ledger in the back room, the face of a man who had already done all the urgent feeling in private and had nothing left to prove in public. The intermediaries spoke first, laid out the situation as they saw it. The losses Schultz had absorbed in the previous 72 hours, the collapse of his inside network, the street-level resistance that showed no sign of resolving itself. They were diplomatic about it, used the language of business, of reassessment, of revised strategy. What they were saying, underneath the diplomatic language, was simple. It didn't work. It's not going to work. You need to stop. Schultz listened. His jaw moved slightly, a small, involuntary thing, barely visible, the only evidence of what was happening underneath the surface. Then he looked at Bumpy, the look of a man searching for something in another man's face, confirmation of weakness, of fear, of the thing he had been telling himself was there for months. He found nothing, just a man looking back at him, waiting. Schultz said, "You want me to believe you did all this in 3 days?" Not a question, almost an accusation. Bumpy said nothing. Let the silence hold the room for 4 full seconds. Then, "I want you to believe what's in front of you." Schultz looked at the table, then at the intermediaries, then back at Bumpy. "The numbers operation," he said. "I'm not walking away from the numbers operation." Bumpy looked at him, steady, clear. "Mr. Schultz." His voice was the same temperature it always was, the same temperature it had been at Mabel's that morning, at the barber shop, in the back room with the swaying bulb, the same temperature it had been on every day of the previous 6 weeks, while Schultz had been building his price and his plans and his network of inside contacts that no longer existed. "Mr. Schultz," he said again, 116th Street was here before you decided you wanted it. It will be here after you've moved on to something else. The people on it are not a revenue stream. They are not a territory. They are not a line in your ledger." He paused. "One beat. You came uptown because you thought nobody would stop you. You were wrong about that. I think you know now that you were wrong about that." Another beat. The room was completely still. Even the intermediaries, men who had sat in rooms like this many times before, men who had heard many versions of many confrontations, even they were still. Bumpy said, "Go home, Mr. Schultz. There's nothing up here that belongs to you." Dutch Schultz looked at him for a long time. 7 seconds. 8. The jaw moved again, once, then stopped. He stood, straightened his jacket, looked at the intermediaries, then, one more time, at Bumpy Johnson, who had not moved, who was still sitting with the same posture he had brought into the room, the same expression, the same absolute, unperformative stillness. Schultz picked up his hat from the table, turned, walked to the door. At the door, without turning back, he said, "This isn't finished." Bumpy said nothing. The door closed. One of the intermediaries exhaled slowly. Bumpy looked at the table. Then he stood, buttoned his coat, nodded once to the men in the room, and left. In the hallway outside, one of the intermediaries, a man named Costello, who had been in these rooms longer than anyone else at that table, caught up with Bumpy at the elevator. He said, quietly, in the manner of a man delivering a genuine assessment rather than a compliment, "You understand he means it, about it not being finished." Bumpy pressed the elevator button, looked at the floor indicator above the doors. "So do I," he said. The elevator arrived. The doors opened. He stepped in. The doors closed. Costello stood in the hallway for a moment. Then he went back to the room. The other men were already talking next steps, revised arrangements, the practical aftermath of what had just happened. Costello sat down, picked up his glass. He said nothing for several minutes. He was thinking about the elevator, about the way Bumpy Johnson had pressed the button and looked at the floor indicator, not at him, not performing anything, just a man waiting for an elevator, and delivered the 2 words that had ended 6 weeks of escalation, 1 bounty, 1 assault, 11 days of intelligence work, and a room full of men who ran things in exactly the same tone he would have used to order coffee. "So do I." Costello put down his glass. "Gentlemen," he said. The room looked at him. "That man is going to be a very long problem for anyone who decides to make him one." Nobody disagreed. Downtown, Dutch Schultz rode back to the Bronx in a car that was very quiet. His men did not speak. He looked out the window the whole way, at the city, at whatever it was he was thinking about. Nobody asked. On 116th Street, it was Tuesday evening. The fishman had already come and gone. The numbers runners were finishing their routes. A woman on the 3rd floor of a building on 118th was putting her children to bed. She didn't know what had happened in a room in Midtown that afternoon. She just knew the way she always knew, that the rent was the same as it had always been, that nothing had changed, that the neighborhood was still the neighborhood, that someone, somewhere, was making sure of that. April 17th, 1935. The morning after, 116th Street woke up the way it always woke up. The fishman came first, then the bread cart, then the women with their aprons already on, moving fast, heads down, carrying the weight of households that had survived another night without knowing how close the night had come to being different. The numbers runners were out by 7. Same routes, same doors, same rhythm, as if nothing had happened. Which was exactly the point. The word moved through Harlem, the way all the important words moved, not through newspapers, not through announcements, not through anything that could be quoted or subpoenaed or held up as evidence of anything. Through the network, mouth to mouth, door to door, the way weather moves through a neighborhood before the clouds arrive. By noon on the 17th, the essential fact had reached every corner that needed to know it. Not the details. Not the room in Midtown, not the men at the table, not the specific words delivered in the specific tone that had ended 6 weeks of escalation. Just the essential fact, the thing that mattered, which was, it was over. Schultz was not coming to 116th Street. Not now. Not on these terms. Not in the way he had planned and priced and built his inside network for. It was over. The reactions were not what you might expect. There was no celebration, no gathering in the street, no visible expression of collective relief that could be pointed to and described. That was not how Harlem received this kind of news. You have to understand, this neighborhood had survived too much to celebrate survival. Survival was not an achievement here. It was a practice, a daily requirement, something you did and then did again tomorrow, because tomorrow would bring its own version of the same requirement. What there was instead was something quieter and more durable than celebration. A settling. The particular settling of a neighborhood that had been holding itself at a specific tension for weeks, not visibly, not loudly, just internally, in the way that people hold themselves tight when something is threatening, something they cannot afford to lose, releasing that tension, not all at once. Gradually, like a building settling after a storm that passed without breaking it. The first visible sign came from Dolores, east side of 8th Avenue. Wednesday morning, April 18th. She opened her door at 8 a.m., the door to the room where she ran her piece of the operation, and she did something she had not done in 6 weeks. She propped it open, just slightly, just enough to let the morning air in. The woman across the hall noticed, didn't say anything, just nodded. Dolores nodded back. That was all. But it meant something that both women understood without requiring language, the specific meaning of a door that had been closed for protection being opened again because the protection was no longer necessary in the same way. Calvin was back on his route by April 19th. The blocks between 116th and 118th. Every door, every name, the rhythm he'd been born into. He walked them the way he always walked them, fast, purposeful, the brown coat regardless of temperature. A woman on 117th Mrs. Patterson, 63 years old, had been playing the same 3 numbers since 1928. She saw him from her window, came down, stood on the stoop. She didn't say anything about what had happened, didn't ask, didn't reference the evening on the pavement, the 7 words, the 22 minutes it had taken for the information to reach the right room. She just said, "You're late this morning." Calvin looked at her, almost smiled. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "Won't happen again." She went back inside. He kept moving. What happened to Dutch Schultz in the months that followed is a matter of record in the way that certain things become record, not because they were carefully documented by people who cared about accuracy, but because they were too significant to be entirely erased. His Harlem operation did not recover. The inside network, the men he believed he had turned, the contacts he had spent weeks and money assembling was gone. Not neutralized dramatically, not dismantled with fanfare, just gone. Unavailable, unresponsive. Impossible to rebuild in a neighborhood that had decided, at a level below organization, below instruction, below anything that could be directed from outside it, that Dutch Schultz was not welcome. He tried twice more in the following months. Different approaches, different men, different entry points. Both times, the same result. The neighborhood simply would not open to him. Doors that should have been accessible were not. People who should have been approachable were not. The intelligence dried up before it could be used. The operations collapsed before they could be established. By autumn of 1935, Schultz had effectively withdrawn from Harlem, not publicly. Not with any statement or announcement or acknowledgement that something had been lost. Men like Schultz did not make those acknowledgments. He simply stopped sending people uptown. Stopped including Harlem in the projections his people ran for the following year, moved his attention to other problems, and he had other problems, significant ones, that were converging on him from directions that had nothing to do with 116th Street. The federal government was building a tax case. Thomas Dewey was building a prosecution. Other men within his own world, men who had their own reasons for finding Dutch Schultz more trouble than he was worth, were having conversations he was not part of. He would be dead by October of that year, shot in a Newark chop house called the Palace Chop House on October 23, 1935. 4 men wounded. 2 died immediately. Schultz died 2 days later in a hospital bed, delirious, speaking in a private language that the stenographer sent to record his last words could not fully decode. His last coherent sentence, as best as anyone could reconstruct it, had nothing to do with Harlem, with Bumpy Johnson, with 116th Street, with the 6 weeks of escalation that had ended in a room in Midtown, with a man who had not raised his voice once. His last coherent sentence was about something else entirely. The things that had defeated him were not the things he had been watching. They never are. On 116th Street, the news of Schultz's death arrived the same way everything arrived. Through the network. Mouth to mouth. Fast and accurate. Bumpy was at Mabel's when he heard. Curtis told him. Set down the coffee pot. Said it plainly. Bumpy looked at his cup. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "What's the weather like today?" Curtis looked at him, looked at the window. "Cold," he said, "but clear." Bumpy nodded, picked up his cup. "Good," he said, and went back to the paper. Later, weeks later, months later, years later, people would ask what Bumpy Johnson said when he heard that Dutch Schultz was dead. The people who were there, the ones who actually knew, they all gave the same answer. He asked about the weather. Some people thought that was strange. Some people thought it was performance, a calculated display of indifference. The people who knew him best knew it was neither. It was just Bumpy Johnson doing what he always did, looking at what was in front of him, the cup, the paper, the window, the clear, cold morning of a neighborhood that was still standing. That was all. That was enough. 14 blocks away, a woman propped open a door she had kept closed for 6 weeks. The morning air came in. She didn't remark on it. She just let it in. There is a specific kind of silence that follows the end of something dangerous. It is not the silence of peace. Not exactly. It is the silence of a neighborhood that has been holding its breath for long enough that it has forgotten what normal breathing feels like, and is now, slowly, carefully, remembering. The weeks after Schultz. November, 1935. The cold came back properly, not the negotiating cold of March, not the considering cold of April, the real cold, the Hudson cold, the kind that means it. 116th Street pulled inward the way it always did in winter, coats heavier, steps faster, the fish man coming earlier, leaving earlier, The transaction quick and without conversation, because the air made conversation expensive. Life resumed the texture it was supposed to have. But underneath the texture, something had changed. Not visibly. Not in any way that could be pointed to and named. Just changed. The way a room changes after a difficult conversation, the furniture is the same, the light is the same, but something in the air is different. Something has been said that rearranges the invisible architecture of the space. The people who lived closest to it, the runners, the controllers, the women on the stoops, the men on the corners, they felt it without being able to articulate it. Most of them didn't try. You didn't, in Harlem, spend too much time trying to articulate the things that had just kept you safe. You just noted them, filed them, moved forward. What people whispered in the barbershops and the diners and the back rooms of buildings on 117th and 118th. What they said in the specific low register of conversations not meant to carry was not about the confrontation, not about the room in Midtown, not about the words delivered in the tone that never changed. It was about the 11 days, the intelligence operation, Wes and the information that moved in one direction while Schultz believed it was moving in another. People talked about that with the particular admiration reserved for things that were too elegant to be fully believed. The admiration you feel when you see a thing done so well that it looks easy, and you know, because you understand how hard things are, that it was not easy at all. He knew everything. A man in the barber shop said, to no one in particular, on a Wednesday afternoon in November, before they moved, he knew everything they were going to do. The man next to him, older, had been on these streets since before anyone at that table was born. Didn't look up from his magazine. Said, he always knows. That's the part people keep not understanding. Nobody replied, because there was nothing to add to that. Bumpy Johnson did not speak publicly about what had happened. Not once. Not to a journalist. Not in any room large enough to be considered a public statement. This was not unusual for him. He had never used words, the way men who needed to be understood used words. He used them precisely, rarely, in the specific quantities required by the specific moment, no more. The journalists who came uptown in the months after Schultz, and some came, drawn by the story they could sense, without being able to fully document, they got very little. The people they spoke to gave them the neighborhood's version of the official story, which was, nothing happened. Everything is fine, has always been fine. What are you referring to, exactly? The journalists went back downtown with notebooks full of non-answers and the feeling of having stood at the edge of something real without ever getting inside it, which was how Harlem preferred it. There was one conversation, one recorded exchange, not by a journalist, not in any official capacity, that gives some access to what Bumpy thought about what had happened. A man named Gerald, a teacher at a school on 119th Street, had grown up on the block, knew Bumpy from childhood, in the specific way of two people who shared a neighborhood long before either of them became anything. Gerald sat with him one evening in December, not at Mabel's, at Gerald's apartment. A kitchen table, 2 glasses, the radiator, doing what the radiator always did, making noise without producing adequate heat. Gerald asked him directly, in the way that only someone with 30 years of proximity could ask directly. Did you know from the beginning how it would end? Bumpy looked at his glass, turned it slightly. I knew how it had to end, he said. That's different. Gerald considered this. What's the difference? Bumpy looked up. Knowing how something ends means you've seen the future, knowing how it has to end. He paused. That just means you understand what's worth protecting and what the other man is willing to lose. Gerald nodded slowly. Then, and Schultz, what was he willing to lose? Bumpy picked up his glass. Everything, he said. That was his problem. A man who's willing to lose everything to get what he wants, that's not strength. That's a different kind of desperation, and desperation makes you readable. He drank, set the glass down. Harlem was never something he could have. He just didn't know how to hear that until he'd already lost everything he spent trying to get it. Gerald would retell that conversation for the rest of his life. Not often. Not to strangers. To people he trusted, in rooms he trusted, in the specific context of trying to explain what Bumpy Johnson was, what he actually was, underneath the stories and the reputation and the name that people said carefully on 116th Street. He always ended the retelling the same way. He said, "Most men in that position, most men who'd just done what he'd done, they'd want you to know. They'd need you to know. The knowing would be part of the point. Bumpy didn't need that. He just needed it to be over. And for the neighborhood to still be standing when it was. The weight of what had been done settled into 116th Street, the way all permanent things settle. Not with drama, not with announcement, but with the slow, undramatic gravity of something that has found its place and intends to stay there. The doors stayed open. The runners kept their routes. Mrs. Patterson on 117th Street played her 3 numbers every morning without interruption, without fear, without the awareness of how close the system that gave her $11.30 in 1932 and the dignity that came with it had come to being taken by a man from the Bronx who had looked at her neighborhood and seen a number in a file. She never knew. Most of them never knew. That was the final discipline. The last and most complete expression of what Bumpy Johnson believed leadership in a place like this required. Not credit, not recognition, not the knowledge, in the people he protected, of how much protecting had been required, just the result, just the neighborhood, standing, doors open, rent the same, children in their shoes. The silence after was not empty. It was full, full of everything that had not happened. Every family that had not been displaced, every operation that had not been absorbed, every runner who had walked their route without knowing that the route had almost belonged to someone else. The silence held all of that. Bumpy Johnson moved through it the way he moved through everything, quietly, precisely, without requiring anyone to understand what they owed it. December 1935. Curtis at Mabel's replaced the bulb above the counter, the one that had been flickering since October. Nobody had mentioned it. It had just been flickering. The new bulb filled the diner with clean light. Bumpy was at his table by 7:15. Eggs, toast. The newspaper folded to the second page. Curtis poured the coffee without being asked. Outside, 116th Street moved through its morning the way it always had, the way it still would. The way, because of what had happened in rooms and on corners and in the silence between things, it always would. Years pass the way, years pass in a neighborhood like Harlem, not gently, not with the clean, cinematic arc of a story that knows it is being told. They pass with difficulty and beauty and loss, and the particular stubbornness of a community that has been told in 100 different languages by 100 different forces that it will not survive and has survived anyway. 17 years after the spring that Dutch Schultz pointed his machinery at 116th Street and found that the street did not move. Bumpy Johnson is at the height of what the newspapers downtown call his power. Though power is the wrong word, the outside word, the word used by people who can only see the thing from a distance and mistake the shape of it for the substance. He is 47 years old. He walks 116th Street the same way he always walked it. Same pace, same coat, same eyes that move slowly and miss nothing. The neighborhood has changed around him, new faces, new pressures, new versions of the same old forces that have always believed Harlem was something to be taken, and has stayed the same in the ways that matter. The doors are open, the runners run their routes. The woman on the 3rd floor of the building on 118th, not Estelle Bowman now, Estelle's daughter. Same apartment, same gap under the front door. She plays the numbers every morning. The system still holds. Alcatraz, a federal case that had been building for years, finally lands with the weight of everything the government had been assembling since they decided that Ellsworth Johnson was a problem they needed to address through the only mechanism available to them. The law, wielded not as justice, but as instrument. He is processed. transported, placed on an island in San Francisco Bay that has been designed to make a man feel like the world has forgotten him. He serves 9 years away from 116th Street, from Mabel's, from the network, from the neighborhood that had been the source and the reason and the point of everything. The streets changed while he was gone. Of course they did. New men moved into the spaces his absence created. Some of them understood what they were inheriting. Most of them didn't. The ones who didn't made the predictable mistakes, the ones that come from treating a neighborhood like a territory rather than a community, from taking more than they gave, from breaking more than they protected. The runners still ran. The numbers still moved. The economic infrastructure that had held Harlem together through the Depression and the war, and the slow, grinding pressure of a city that had never decided whether it wanted this neighborhood to thrive, it still functioned. But it functioned differently, with less of the thing that had made it more than just a criminal enterprise, less of the practice of knowing every name on every door, less of the debts held in memory rather than ledgers, less of the understanding that the neighborhood was the thing to be protected, not the thing to be drawn from. People felt the difference. They felt it the way you feel the difference between a building that has a foundation and a building that is being held up by habit and momentum and the memory of when it was solid. He walks back into Harlem. No announcement, no ceremony, no gathering in the street to mark the return of the man who had held 116th Street together in the spring of 1935, when a man from the Bronx had decided it was his. He just comes back, takes the same streets, finds the same corners, different faces on them, but the same corners, goes to Mabel's. Curtis is gone, retired, moved to family in another state. The specific exit of a man who stayed long enough and knew when to leave. The new man behind the counter is younger, doesn't know the history of the table by the back window, doesn't know about the 50-cent tips for 30-cent coffee, doesn't know what that table witnessed over 30 years of 7:15 mornings and folded newspapers and the quiet machinery of a man who ran a neighborhood the way a good doctor runs a practice, through knowledge, through presence, through the understanding that the people who depend on you are not a resource. They are the reason. Bumpy sits at the table, orders eggs, toast, coffee. The new man brings it. Bumpy says, "Thank you," opens the newspaper, and the street outside resettles almost imperceptibly, almost without evidence, into something it had not quite been for 9 years. Something that resembles what it was supposed to be. Malcolm X is killed on a Sunday afternoon in February at the Audubon Ballroom on 166th Street. Bumpy Johnson says nothing publicly. The people who know him say he was never quite the same after. Not visibly. Not in any way a newspaper could report. Just not the same. There are men you lose, whose absence changes the temperature of everything around you, not because of what they did, because of what they represented, what was possible because they existed. Malcolm had represented something to Bumpy Johnson that did not have a clean name, the possibility that a man born into the same Harlem, the same conditions, the same machinery of a society designed to limit him could become something that the society had to reckon with on his own terms, not through compromise, through clarity. Bumpy understood clarity. He had practiced it his entire life. He sat with that loss, the way he sat with everything, quietly, privately, without requiring anyone to understand the weight of it. He is 62 years old. On the evening of July 7th, he is at a card game on West 116th Street, the same street, always the same street. The men around the table are men he has known for years, faces that carry the specific familiarity of people who have been in the same rooms through enough of life's architecture that they have become part of the furniture of your understanding of the world. He is playing cards. He orders coffee. The coffee arrives. He picks up his hand, looks at it, and then, quietly, without drama, without announcement, without the kind of exit that a man of his stature might have been expected to make, Ellsworth Raymond Johnson puts down his cards, leans back in his chair, and is gone. Heart failure, the doctors will say later. The street will say something different. The street will say that a man who had carried that much weight for that many years, who had held together that much, protected that much, absorbed that much, eventually, inevitably, the weight finds the place where you're weakest, and it rests there. What Harlem remembers, not the Harlem of 1968, not the Harlem of 1935, but the Harlem that exists now, that carries all those years in its bones the way all old places carry their history, is not the confrontation, not the room in Midtown, not the 11 days, not the bounty that dissolved before it could be collected. What Harlem remembers is simpler than that. It remembers a man who walked its streets for 40 years and knew every name on every door, who understood that a neighborhood is not a territory, that the people in it are not a resource. That leadership, real leadership, the kind that doesn't require a title or an announcement or a public record, is a daily practice of presence and memory and the thousand small acts of someone who has decided that the thing worth protecting is worth more than what they stand to gain from abandoning it. On 116th Street today, his name is still spoken with a particular weight, not loudly, not for effect, not for the benefit of anyone who needs it explained, just with weight, the weight of memory, the weight of what was held together by one man's absolute refusal to let it be taken, the weight of 14 families who paid the same rent in November 1934 because someone sat across a table from a landlord and spoke quietly for 8 minutes, the weight of a woman walking away from a rent payment feeling like herself, the weight of a daughter in college for the first time in 4 generations, the weight of a runner in a brown coat walking his route on a Tuesday morning in April 1935, not knowing how close that route had come to belonging to someone else. Some men leave buildings behind. Some men leave statues. Some men leave their names on things that can be photographed and pointed to and included in the kind of record that gets written down and kept. Bumpy Johnson left none of that. He left something harder to photograph. He left a neighborhood that was still standing when it should, by several different calculations, have fallen. He left a street that still carries, in its daily rhythm, the fish man, the bread cart, the women moving fast, heads down, carrying everything, the specific shape of what it looks like when someone decided it was worth protecting, and protected it, quietly, precisely, without requiring anyone to understand what they owed it. 116th Street, Tuesday morning, 7:15. The table by the back window is empty. The coffee is on. The newspaper is folded to the second page. Nobody sits down. But the table is set. It has always been set. It will always be set. For the man who understood that the neighborhood was the thing worth keeping and kept it